Camping alone was something I'd always wanted to try. No distractions, and no one to bother me, just the peace of the wilderness. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any marked trails or campsites. The drive was long, but when I finally found the perfect clearing, near a small stream, it felt worth it. The isolation was exactly what I needed. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and by dusk I had a small fire crackling. The sky turned dark quickly, and as the night closed in, I felt a strange mix of calm, but also of vulnerability. The silence was almost too quiet, but I pushed that feeling aside. After all, I'd come here for this, complete silence and solitude. Around 10 p.m., the fire had died down to glowing embers. I was sitting by it, about to call it a night, when I heard something. A rustling. Maybe 50 feet away. I froze and listened. The sound was steady, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush or leaves. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. Just as I was about to turn in, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint light of the dying fire. It was a man. His clothes were dirty and ragged. His hair was wild and matted. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in a very long time. "Hey," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you. I've been out here for a while, just trying to survive." I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I hadn't seen a single person all day. How had this guy found me? More importantly, how long had he been out here? I didn't want to think anyone else was around, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" He gave a half smile, but there was something off about it. "Just hungry and cold. Thought I'd warm up for your fire for a bit. Is that okay?" I didn't want to say yes, but I couldn't think of reason to say no. "Yeah, sure. Have a seat," I told him. He shuffled closer to the fire and sat down, staring into the embers. I could see his hands trembling, whether from the cold or something else. I couldn't tell. The more I looked at him, the more I noticed the hollow look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "You been out here for long?" I asked. "Long enough," he muttered. His gaze didn't leave the fire, though. "No one comes out here. Not often. It's a good place to be left alone," he told me. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. The silence between us felt heavy and unnatural. I wanted him to leave badly, but I couldn't exactly tell a homeless man to get lost in the middle of nowhere. After a long pause, he spoke again, softer this time. "I used to camp out here all the time, years ago, before it all went bad." "What do you mean?" I asked him. He finally looked up at me, his eyes dull and empty. "Before people started disappearing." My blood went cold. I forced a fake laugh, trying to brush it off. "What do you mean, disappearing?" He leaned closer, his face now lit by the dim glow of the fire. "You hear things in these woods, things that aren't natural. People come out here thinking they're alone, but they're not. Something's always watching." My throat tightened. I glanced at the trees, suddenly feeling exposed. "You ever see anyone disappear?" I asked, regretting the question the moment it met my mouth. His lips curled into that strange, unsettling smile again. "Maybe. I just know what happens when they do." I stood up, pretending to stretch, but really just wanting to put some distance between us. "Well, I think I'm going to turn in. It's getting late," I told him. He stayed seated. His eyes followed me as I moved towards the tent. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't be here long." I nodded, but didn't say anything. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and laid there, listening with my hatchet in my hand. I could hear the man moving around the campfire, but I didn't dare look. My mind raced. Who was this guy, and what did he mean by people disappearing? Minutes passed, and finally I heard him leave. The footsteps faded into the distance, but I didn't feel any safer. I lay there for hours, wide awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, waiting for something to happen. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. But it didn't last long. I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding in my chest. Something felt wrong. The fire had completely died out, and the woods were utterly silent. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around the tent. That's when I noticed it. Outside, just at the edge of the light, something had been placed next to my tent. I unzipped the flap and cautiously stepped out. There, lying in the dirt, was my wallet. The same wallet I had left inside my backpack. My blood ran cold as I slowly backed away. That man had come back. He'd gone through my stuff while I slept. I looked through my wallet, and the rest of my stuff was there. He only took a small amount of cash. At that moment, I quickly packed up all my things and used the compass app on my phone to get back to my car, which was parked on the side of the road. I don't know who that guy was or what his real intentions were, but I'm glad all he did was take the money out of my wallet. It could have ended so much worse. I can now honestly say I am never camping alone again. I had been planning my solo camping trip for months. Life in the city was just getting to me. Constant phone calls, meetings, and just the noise of it all. I needed a break, some quiet to clear my head. So when I finally had a weekend off, I packed my gear and drove out to a secluded spot in the woods. A friend had mentioned the space. It was remote, but it was perfect if you're looking for peace. I got there late in the afternoon. The sun starting to dip just behind the trees. There was no one around for miles, just the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees, and the occasional bird call. I found the perfect clearing by a small creek. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and started to relax. At first, it was everything I had hoped for. The stillness of the woods was calming, almost like a blanket of silence wrapping around me. As the night fell, I sat by the fire, eating some of the snacks I brought, and just listening to the crackle of the wood burning. It was truly peaceful. But then, as the fire began to die down and the darkness crept around the edges of my camp, the mood started to shift. The woods at night weren't just quiet. They were dead silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the oppressive blackness pressing in from all sides of my camp. I remember feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It hit me all at once. I tried to shake it off. Just my nerves, I told myself. It's just the isolation. But no matter what I did, the feeling wouldn't leave, and it only got worse. Then, I heard it. Faint at first, like a low whisper. It sounded like someone calling my name. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed up. I listened, straining my ears, but the voice was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, and that I had imagined it, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. Only clearer this time. Someone was calling my name from somewhere in the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, though I didn't really want an answer. No one replied, but then there was a crunch. Something stepped on a branch, not far from the edge of my camp. I swung my light in that direction, but again, there was nothing. The beam of the flashlight revealed only the dense underbrush and tall trees. I tried to convince myself that could be an animal, maybe a deer, but in my gut, I knew it wasn't. No animal calls you by your name. The voice came again, louder this time, and closer. And then, from the opposite direction, another voice. This one only softer, like a woman's voice. It was calling my name too. My stomach turned. How could someone know my name? I hadn't told anyone I was coming out here. In this place, this part of the forest wasn't even on the map. Panic set in. I quickly stamped out the fire, plunging myself into almost complete darkness. I didn't want to give away my position. My hands were shaking as I packed up my gear, but I was moving too slow. I could still hear faint voices, but now from both sides of me, closing in. They were laughing now, their laughter low and raspy, and it echoed through the trees. I bolted. I grabbed my backpack, barely managing to zip it up, and ran into the woods, away from the voices. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I tore through the underbrush. My breath was loud in my ears, my chest tight, but all I could think was to get away. I just kept on running. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, it felt like forever. Eventually I had to stop. My legs were burning and my lungs were on fire. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of it all. The good thing was now the voices were gone, and they were replaced by the usual sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I thought maybe I had outrun whatever, or whoever it was, but then I shone my flashlight around. My stomach dropped. Right there in front of me, hanging from a low branch, was something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden figure, crudely carved, swinging gently in the breeze, and tied around its neck was a strip of fabric from my jacket. I stared at it, frozen, and my mind was racing. How could that be? I hadn't even taken off my jacket today. Before I could react, I heard the same voice again, right next to my ear, so close that I felt the breath on my skin. "Don't leave," it whispered. I dropped a flashlight and ran. I stopped after a while and huddled down behind a big tree. I went at my phone to see my car was parked. Thankfully, my data was still working, and it showed my car was parked a half a mile east on my Google Maps. I stood up and continued to my car, not running, but trying to be fast. I wasn't trying to spend another minute in that forest. Once I got back to my car, I had to take a minute to calm down. It feels like I had just escaped a horror movie scenario, like the Blair Witch Project or something. I never told anyone the story before because it seems too cliche and fake, but I promise you, it's not. I would never advise to go camping by yourself. It might not end up how you want it to. I always thought camping alone would be a peaceful escape from everything. No people, no noise, just you in the wilderness. That was my first mistake. The trip started off fine. I found a secluded spot in the woods, far from any trails or campsites, just the way I liked it. It was late October, so the air had that crisp bite, and the leaves crunched under my boots as I set up my tent. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the trees. The world felt still, almost too still, but I brushed it off, just my mind playing tricks on me. Once I had the fire going, I sat back and relaxed. The only sound was the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the solitude I'd been craving. I even told myself it was perfect, until the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest grew darker than I had anticipated. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. That's when I noticed something odd. There was no sounds. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind. Just dead silence. But it was kind of relaxing. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up a few hours later to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't loud, more like the faint rustling of fabric. My heart started racing. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, but then I heard it again. I held my breath trying to listen. There it was, the unmistakable sound of fingers brushing against my tent's nylon. A shiver crawled up my spine. I grabbed the flashlight next to me, turned it on, and pointed at the tent walls. Nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the same empty, silent woods outside. I tried to calm myself down, telling itself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I eventually drifted back to sleep, but when I woke up again, it was something far worse. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was morning, and faint sunlight filtered through the tent walls, but there was something else too. A dark smear across the fabric. I sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. There, written on what looked like blood, was a message smeared across the outside of the tent. The message read, "You're not alone." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my sleeping bag and tent. The first thought was that this had to be some kind of sick joke, but I was miles away from anyone. No one knew I was here. I didn't even have cell service out here. Panic set in. I quickly packed up my gear, trying to ignore the dread that had settled deep in my gut. I glanced around the campsite. There was no footprints, no sign of anyone being there. But the message was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I am being watched. As I hurried through the woods, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something following me. But the forest remained eerily empty, just as silent as the night before. I made it back to my car in record time, and peeled out of there without looking back. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that message. What could it have been? Who or what could have done it? It wasn't until I got home, safe in my apartment, that I let myself breathe. But the relief didn't last long. As I unloaded my gear, I found something in my backpack that shouldn't have been there. A small, folded piece of paper. I hadn't packed it, and I knew I hadn't touched my bag since that night. I unfolded it with trembling hands, and in the same dark, rusty, bloody stain as the writing on my tent, there was one word. Soon. I think about that note, wonder what the word soon meant, but I don't think I want to know.